So welcome back on this Tuesday, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when I'm going to talk about some of the questions that you people have asked. I will tell you that there were over 500 questions in the last couple hours, and obviously I can't answer them all. They're all good questions, but I picked some that looked really interesting to me. Once again, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these. And again, a reminder, I do not have a staff. It's just me and my 35 or more years of doing American history. So if I get stuff wrong, forgive me. We'll fix it either in print on the videos or the next time around or in something else I write. What else was I going to tell you? I don't remember. So let me just get right to this material. Oh, if by any chance this kicks out as it has in the past, I'll just pick up the video again. I'll end it and then I'll pick up the video again. So if it goes blank, as it has a couple times in the past, don't freak out. I'll be back once I figure out the technical stuff on this end. All right, so a bunch of questions here, and I'm going to maybe give short shrift to the first two because I want to spend more time on some of the later ones because they're really interesting questions. And I want to start here with something Kevin Barrett asked, but a whole bunch of people chimed in on, and that is, what impact, if any, did the 1918 pandemic have on elections and politics of the day? And you'll remember that the 1918 pandemic was the influenza epidemic, the Spanish flu as it was called, although it did not start in Spain. It started, we believe, in Kansas, and that swept across the world and took hundreds of thousands of lives and dramatically changed the entire world by the time it was done. But the question was not about any of that or about the discovery of how that influenza was made up, which is, again, something that just absolutely fascinated me. So I got obsessed with it about 20 years ago. And someday, if we ever have time and things are fun again, I will tell you about that process of discovering what exactly that influenza was. But the question was about the pandemic on that election, on the politics. So what we know about what the pandemic did to the 1918 elections was that it made voter turnout much lower. Significantly lower in the 40s as opposed to in the 50s where it normally would have been. That's not really that much of a surprise, but did the pandemic throw the election, the 2018 election, which went heavily for the Republicans over Woodrow Wilson? You'd have to run really careful numbers on that, but my gut sense as a political historian of that era is no. There was an awful lot of stuff going on in 1918 that had nothing to do with the pandemic. And if you will remember, the pandemic was bad in that spring, but then it had a lull over the summer, and then it was a second wave in the fall that was really, really, really deadly. And that had only really begun when the election season was running. It really started taking off in October, and really took off in November. So I don't think people had really grappled yet with what those numbers would look like. It's much clearer in retrospect to look at historical numbers, because when you're experiencing, you just don't know. So for example, right now, if you're sitting in a town that has yet to have a COVID-19 death, you can sit there and say, hey, what's the problem? But if you're Athens, Georgia, or something where it has just swept through, you're going to look at the numbers and say, oh, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Well, that was even more clear in 1918 when there was much less communication about what was happening where. So anyway, there are other things going on in 1918 that affected the midterm elections of that year, and they were these. First of all, the World War I is ending. And the end of World War I is a really important psychological moment for Americans, for Westerners in general, but certainly for Americans, because they had gone into that war with such optimism and such hopes for what it would mean at the end of the day for a new kind of world. And what had really happened during World War I was the entire world had been wrenched. We'd gone from a period when alliances were really among leaders who were from the same family, who had kinship ties, sort of empires, to a new kind of modernity when things were going to be decided not by secret familial treaties, but rather more according to what seemed like bureaucratic systems. You also had the change really during that war, although not entirely, but really during that war, from the old-fashioned heroic seeming horse charges and the things that people thought of when they thought of war before World War I, to the deadly rat-ridden trenches and the barbed wire of World War I, and the tanks that rolled across the barren landscape, and the scars on the land, and the people who were killed from artillery that they never even saw coming because of how far you could lob artillery shells by World War I. So there was this, by the end of the war, there was a real disillusionment and a sense of loss, of the heroism of individuality, but also of a whole world that was lost. And you can see this in the literature of the period. John Dos Passos, for example, and of course Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and the people who looked at what seemed to be almost the mechanization of human life and said, this is not what we signed up for, this is not what we wanted. And that when you get something like that, when people feel that their ideals have been betrayed, you get somebody voting for the opposite party. And that's one of the things that was driving the I'm sorry, I keep saying 1918, of course. That's one of the things driving the 1918 midterm election sweep for the Republican Party. The other thing was that Woodrow Wilson did not handle that midterm election terribly well. Looks like I have frozen. Am I gone? I'm frozen here. No, you guys are still seeing stuff. Okay. Yeah, okay. Looks like it's still operating here. The other thing that's happening in 2018, and what Woodrow Wilson did badly, was he became so invested in the idealism of his cause and in his very principled strictness, if you will, that he made a really bad mistake going into the election of 2000. He keeps doing that, of 1918, in which he told people to vote for the Democrats because it was with the Democrats that they would be able to achieve a just and lasting peace. And he equated the Democratic Party with Americanness. Now, that was something that the Republican Party had done during the Civil War. That is precisely what they did. They said, you're either a Republican or you're un-American. But when he tried to do it in 1918, the Republicans, who were led then by Henry Cabot Lodge, just went ballistic. And they really hadn't been able to criticize him during the war, because traditionally we don't criticize a president during a war. But as soon as that happened, all gloves were off. And that's when Henry Cabot Lodge just really goes after Woodrow Wilson. And that's also, by the way, when we get the fear in America, prompted by Henry Cabot Lodge, that if America joined alliances, international alliances, in this case the League of Nations, that we would end up with a sort of a one world communism where Americans couldn't decide their own fate. That whole idea of one worldism actually comes from the 1918 midterm elections. So the pandemic keeps down the vote, it lowers the vote. But did that swing the election? I have not run the numbers. I'll tell you that right there. I have not run the numbers and probably never will. But my gut sense is that there's a lot more going on ideologically in that election that made the difference, not so much the lower turnout. Now, that being said, the traditionally in the 20th century, low turnout, well, I shouldn't say the 20th century, let's say in the present, traditionally in the last 20 years, low turnout has been very good for the Republican Party and bad for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party tends to do much better when turnout is higher. And this is one of the reasons, of course, that Donald Trump keeps talking about how bad mail-in voting is. Now, statistically, mail-in voting does not privilege one party over the other. It doesn't seem to make a difference between mail-in voting and showing up to vote. But if you can make sure that certain people don't get mail-in ballots, you can depress some of the vote. So that might be part of what's going on. Trump seems to believe that mail-in voting is going to hurt the Republican Party. He has said so a number of times. But there's also the possibility that he is talking about mail-in voting being so bad because he is sowing the seeds to argue that the 2020 election was not fairly decided. And that's my guess, is what he is up to. And I'm not going to talk more about that right now, although I know you're all salivating for that at this point, because I'm going to be writing about it a lot in the future. And one of the things I've discovered is if I tell you guys stuff on these videos, like I did the history of the post office, I'm not really so interested in writing it. So I think I better keep my powder dry on that one. All right, so that was one answer, and here's another one, probably not as long as you wanted, but I'm going to do another one with a not as long, because I want to hope to squeeze in 5 today. We'll see. The next question I'm not going to do a great job with in terms of time is Anne-Marie Salin's question about President Ford's pardon of President Nixon. Was this a good idea or a bad idea, and what are the implications from the longer view of history? What if he hadn't pardoned Nixon? And what would happen if a future President Pence, that is, if Donald Trump steps down, for example, pardoned former President Trump? Would that be valid only for federal charges and not for state charges? I wanted to put this one in because I love this question, and I feel really strongly about this. And I feel really strongly about it because I used to do a podcast with a terrific guy, and we actually had this was a question that came up on the podcast, and the two men, the guest and my co-host, took the position that it was the right thing to do for Ford to pardon Nixon, and I got really upset by that because I had thought through the implications, and now I feel like it's my thing to explain why I think it was a bad idea. At the time, of course, I was very young, but at the time I thought it was the right thing to do, because what Ford was trying to do was to bring together the warring factions in American society. And on the one hand, he pardoned Nixon, and on the other hand, he pardoned people who had dodged the draft and gone to Canada so they didn't get drafted. And theoretically, this was going to be something for every side. In fact, we all tend to have forgotten about the second half of that and remember only the first half of it, the pardon of Nixon. And I think the pardon of Nixon was a terrible move. I understand why he did it, but what it did was it established a precedent in modern America that presidents appear to be above the law. I think that had we not had a pardon for President Nixon, we would not have had the Iran-Contra affair. We certainly would not have had weapons of mass destruction, and we probably would not have had a Donald Trump presidency, all because of the recognition that you did not have blanket amnesty for law breaking if you were a president. And that's really something that's established by the pardon of Nixon. Now, what would have happened if, in fact, Nixon had been tried? Because having been resigned, he could no longer, he couldn't be impeached. He was already out of office. Once again, a reminder that impeachment is not a criminal trial. It does not have to be based on any laws. It simply says that the Congress does not believe that the president is fulfilling his duty or her duty, or has committed crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors, which were explicitly not written down. Every time you hear, oh, well, there's got to be a crime committed, that's just wrong. It's just wrong on a number of levels, not least because when they wrote the Constitution, there were no laws yet, so they didn't know what the laws were going to be. Anyway, so he was not going to get convicted. What happened with the impeachment of President Nixon, of course, is that the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach him. It was going to go to the House. The votes were there to impeach him. And then the Senate went to the White House. Senators, not the Senate. Senators led by Barry Goldwater went to the White House and said, dude, you're out of here. We're going to convict you if you don't resign. They didn't probably use that language. I expect there might have been some expletives in that. But they said, you got to go. That's why he resigns. Anyway, had he been brought up then for criminal behavior, even if he had not been convicted of criminal behavior, and you know, I'm not going to speak to that because the charges were never brought. Who knows if they ever were charges? But if he had not been pardoned, if he had had to go through the ringer of a public trial, a public investigation, I think future politicians would have been really hesitant to dirty their hands the way that Ronald Reagan's people did with the Iran-Contra affair, for example, which was clearly illegal, or that other people have done on other occasions. I think it's not a bad idea to send a signal that a president is not above the law. And having done that, we might not have been looking at where we are now. It's one of the reasons I feel so strongly that we must hold to the principle that nobody is above the law. And nobody is below the law either. You know, the idea that certain people get justice in America and other people do not is, of course, not fair to the people who do not. But at the end of the day, it endangers all of us because we must be equal before the law. All right. All right. So that's as far as I've gone with that. Next question from James Charles. He said, quote, I have a question about, not a quote, I'm sorry, I tend to paraphrase these. I have a question about the proper role of political ideology in politics and governance. he says that I talk about movement conservatives versus the concept of the liberal consensus, and how how movement conservatives are so adhered to their ideology that they are unable to compromise. But he asked about the issue of ideological purity. Is ideological purity a good thing in a candidate or a bad thing in a candidate? Is it to be demanded or abhorred? And if somebody is bound to a certain ideology, does that mean that he or she can't bend or compromise? And then he goes on and says, Mike Pence famously says, quote, "I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order." Are we supposed to understand that every decision or every policy has to meet his particular definition of all those terms, or will he oppose it, or he will oppose it? Is that governing? That's a really great question. It's actually two questions. So let's take them apart, starting with Pence, Michael Pence, because and then I want to go to the larger question of ideology and ideological purity. So Mike Pence starts with, "I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order." And that, to me, is deeply problematic in the sense that by definition, we do not have a religious government in America. And that is one of the things that was so radical, so innovative, and so exciting about the concept of American democracy, was that it was not based in religion or in birth order, that is, in the idea of an aristocracy or an oligarchy. A little bit different, but the idea that we could have a nation that was built not on those traditional things, not on those things that were conceived of as being handed down by some higher power, but rather on a body of laws. On a body of laws that could be changed, and on a body of laws to which everybody was responsible and could be prosecuted. That idea that we are not beholden to traditional religion or traditional forms of social structures changes what America is all about. Because what it means is that our government theoretically should be based on what works as a social compact. And that goes back to John Locke, the idea of the Enlightenment, that you could create a society that was based not on orders from a higher power, but rather by observing the world and saying, hey, things will work better if we do it this way. And trying it and having everybody go, oh yeah, that was a great idea. Or people trying it and going, man, that sucked. We're not going to do it that way anymore, and then changing the law. And that concept, the Enlightenment concept of a nation based in a body of laws, is really what America brought to the table, and why this nation has been so deeply rooted in the Enlightenment, and why that's so important. Now, that's not to say you can't be a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a fan of the flying spaghetti monster, if that's what you care about in this country. But it means that that is not part of our governmental system. And the reason for that is not only because our founders adhered to the Enlightenment, but also because they understood what it meant to have governments that were based in religion. And what that meant in Europe, of course, in the middle of the 18th century, was towns that literally ran with blood. Because if you are fighting for God, as opposed to fighting for a social compact, you can't stop. And that meant that people were going to be slaughtered. And we have seen that in our lifetimes. The idea that if you are fighting for God, you cannot stop fighting. And you must kill your enemies. And what the founders were saying is that's not the way to order society. That society does not have to go at each other's throats to come up with a social compact that works for the good of everybody. So when Mike Pence starts with, I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order, I've got a real problem with it. If he were to say, I'm an American, a Republican, a conservative, and a Christian, I'd be, you go, dude. But in the idea that he is putting religion above our civic identity, at the same time he is asking for a place in that civic identity, to me is a huge problem. Meanwhile, I would not want my minister to go to the front of the church and say, I am, first of all, a Republican or a Democrat, because that doesn't belong in church. It's a question of what field you're in. And so I have a problem with Pence starting with, I am a Christian before anything else, as a member of our body, of our civic culture, our political culture. All right, so that was one question about Pence. But let's go back to to the question of ideological purity. And on that, that's a really interesting question, because there is a really big difference between principles and ideology. That is, or at least a strict ideology. And I would suggest that we want our politicians to have principles that we share, but not to be ideologically rigid. And let me unpack that a little bit. Barbara Lubanus asked, the current GOP ruling by ideology does not allow for compromise. And then she asked, are there other examples of this type of governing in America's history, and what was the outcome? And the reason I mention that here is because it's really important also to remember that there's a difference, while there's a difference between principles and ideology, there's also a difference between principles and politics. And that's not to say politics is unprincipled. Everyone, every once in a while you hear, oh, they're all the same, they're all criminals or whatever. No, politics is the art of governing and the way that happens. And yeah, there's some real rotten people in it, but there are also some very good people in it. It's just like anything else. And so what I would suggest is you want people to have principles, but you have to understand the difference between principles and politics. So let's go through that a little bit. When I say there's a difference between principles and ideology, what I mean is this: I want the people who represent me to have principles that I believe are in line with American values, our best American values. And I'm an idealist. But it's not an ideal world. I'm sorry, let me finish with ideology. Having principles is different than saying, I cannot compromise on this ideology because this is the only way the world can possibly work. Generally, good principles will win out. But if you go into a situation saying, I am 100% unwilling to compromise, what happens is you are sort of getting rid of the whole Enlightenment idea, and you're also forcing your opponents to continue to move towards you, which is exactly what the movement conservatives have done. They would go into a negotiation, and the Democrats would would be over here, and they'd say, okay, we'll meet you here. And the movement conservatives would say, well, we're not moving. The Democrats would say, okay, we'll meet you here. And they say, well, we're not moving. And pretty soon you've ended up with policies that are much farther toward their principles than, or their ideology than most Americans would like. And that's not governance, that's ideology, that's a different thing. So the difference between principles, as I said, and in politics is this: I want people to have principles, but politics is the art of compromise. It's kind of governing by committee. You're not going to get what you want. Ever. What do they say? The people who are the best at governing are the ones who piss everybody off or who make everybody angry, because you give to some and you take from others. And that has always been the way you govern. Somebody got something, somebody else got something, and we kind of drove down the middle. That means that the idea of an ideological position that is uncompromising completely drives that into the ditch, because you can't compromise. You can't end up governing because you are solely going down one path, and that's where we are right now. So I would suggest that you need to have principles, but you also have to understand that politics is about especially in America, is about building coalitions. So one of the things that you don't see right now in the White House is Donald Trump can't build a coalition. He doesn't know how to. He doesn't know how to say to somebody, oh, vote with me on this bill and I'll give you this. And the great politicians do that. They're wheeler dealers. And that means a lot of people think they're corrupt. A lot of people hate them. They move the ball across the finish line. And that's one of the reasons that that people have rallied behind Joe Biden, and why he gets a lot of eye rolls as well, is because he's worked with a lot of people that one person or another, or one group or another, thinks is unsavory. And he does that because he knows you've got to build a coalition to get the ball again across the finish line. And so when you look at politics, you tend to look at people's teams. Are the teams people who can get the ball across the finish line? And how are they going to do it? Who's going to be on the team? How are they going to reach out? How are they going to make things work? And again, if you're interested in this, one of the great wheeler dealers, of course, was LBJ, who in many ways was a vile man. but he knew every button to push to accomplish very good ends, what I consider very good ends with that. So he's fascinating to watch when he is, for example, trying to force people to sit on the commission looking into JFK's assassination. People did not want to sit on that sucker. And he did all kinds of stuff to, not even to twist their arms, to say, you can't back out. I mean, he really put people in impossible positions, but at the end of the day, he got what he wanted and he moved the ball across the finish line. So a lot of politics is simply that, building coalitions, giving somebody this, giving somebody a pass on this, getting this over the finish line, putting together a coalition to get an end that your people want. All right, I'm going to come back to that in just a second, because Barbara asked, do you have an example of this, about the times that purity could be a problem? And yes, I do. And that is one of my favorite elections, as favorite elections go, the election of 1844. Because the election of 1844 is almost the classic election where people doubled down on purity and it backfired. So what happens in 1844 is that there are two people running, and that is a Democrat, James K. Polk, and he is running against a Whig named Henry Clay. Henry Clay is from Kentucky, and James K. Polk is kind of a dark horse when he goes to run in that. It's kind of a long story, but he comes kind of out of nowhere. But he ends up making his entire pitch for his election in 44 on the issue of slavery. Because what's happened is after 1830, in 1830, I keep going back further and further, Mexico revolts and becomes takes control of Mexico from the Spanish in 1821. And when they do that, they invite Americans to come into what is then Mexican territory. And they do. A lot of people go from the southeast into Mexican territory. But then in 1830, the Mexicans outlaw slavery in that territory. And the Americans who are in that territory want to continue to have slavery. So they break off. This is the whole Alamo story. They break off and they have a revolution and they want to join America. And and this is the background of the 1844 election, there's a fight over whether or not America should take this territory. And James K. Polk says, absolutely. 1844, I'm running on the platform of annexing Texas. Now, the person who's running against him, Henry Clay, is a slave owner. He's from Kentucky. He actually doesn't like slavery very much. He wants to get rid of it, but he believes in gradual emancipation and what was at the time called colonization. There's a fantasy that a number of Southerners had that you could somehow ship the African Americans, who were as American as anybody else was, back to Africa, in which, again, even was a fantasy even at the time. Just logistically, it was not possible to put that many people on boats and all that. But he's part of this colonization movement. And what would have happened to the colonization movement is itself an interesting question, had it ever been put into place. But anyway, he's not pure on the slavery question. He doesn't want Texas, but he's not really willing to come out and say that because he needs Southern votes. So he kind of waffles on the question, even though he has said, I'm not so keen on slavery, we got to get rid of slavery, but by the way, I have some slaves, so you can vote for me. It's kind of a waffle on it. Well, he makes enough anti-slavery people furious that they refuse to vote for him in that election. But of course, they can't vote for Polk, who's advocating the spreading of slavery into Texas and the taking of Texas. And so what happens is they break off and they vote for the man who's running for the Liberty Party. He's a man named James Birney, and he ends up taking about 2.3% of the American vote in the election of 1844. So why do we care about that? We care about that because Henry Clay obviously never becomes president. He keeps missing the presidency again and again across his career. But he loses that election by 1.4%. So Bernie takes 2.3% of the vote. Henry Clay loses by 1.4% of the vote. Well, why do we care about this? Because having lost the election for Clay, the Liberty people who couldn't sully their hands with voting for Clay, they threw the election to James K. Polk, And this, of course, means that America takes all that southwestern land, spreads slavery into that southwestern land, is going to go to war with Mexico over that southwestern land, take the rest of the American Southwest under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and then start the move at that point for making slavery national. That part of taking Mexico in 1844, what that does is it opens up a lot more land, gives a lot more power to the large Southern planters who, the next decade, the 1850s, take over the American government and try to turn the entire country over to slavery, and that's what sparks a civil war. So there's an example of a place where purity meant that the waffly slave owner didn't end up in the White House, but what it meant is the institution of slavery spread dramatically, gave a ton more power to slave owners, and ended up tearing the Union apart. So that's a place where it probably was not a good idea to focus on purity rather than on politics and who was going to get the ball across the finish line at the end of the day. Now, of course, the reason people are asking about this right now is because of the people who voted for, who wanted Bernie Sanders to be in the White House, and their reluctance at this point to join the Biden the Biden train, if you will, despite the fact that Sanders has been pushing them very hard to do so. And again, what I'd go back to there is somebody who's interested in the practicalities of politics as opposed to purity, is that Sanders is no fool. Sanders is not a coalition builder. That's not his role in our politics, because not everybody can be a coalition builder. If everybody's a coalition builder, nothing ever moves. I mean, you never get pressure to do one thing or another. Sanders is a pressure point. You know, he gets those ideas out there and he pushes those ideas and he keeps being in people's faces about it. That isn't what's going to get the ball across the line. That's what's going to push the people who can get the ball across the line to move his direction. And he knows that. He has worked very well with Biden in the past. And if you've noticed, Biden and Sanders together have joined forces and put together these 6 task forces of each putting in their own people to create an approach to 6 major different aspects of American society. And again, Sanders is no fool. He's going to take his pressure. And by the way, so is, he is not the only one who's going to do this. So is Klobuchar, so is Buttigieg, and so, of course, is Elizabeth Warren, going to use their delegates at the Democratic National Convention to put pressure on the Democratic platform, as they should. That's how the system works. And so this is, again, sort of a classic example of the difference between ideology, principle, and politics. And it's not necessarily a bad system. And again, when people sit there and say, this is all corrupt, you know, they're all selling out, you know, it's very easy for those of us who sit in our own bubbles to say, by God, I'm the only one who knows how the country should work. But the reality is that I don't see the world the same way as someone who lives in rural Texas or in the city of San Jose, and I need somebody who can build a coalition between me and them, and my way is not necessarily always the right way. So that is my answer to the difference between ideology, principle, and politics. All right. So now this is what I really wanted to get into, and I probably will spend more time on this than you might be interested in, although it's really wonderful stuff. And that is that a bunch of you, 4 of you actually, but I'm going to put you in pick up different aspects of this at different times, have been asking about propaganda and propaganda in American society. And Melinda Marino asked, social media, bots, Cambridge Analytica style public opinion manipulation, and so on. Excuse me, what's happening with all this, especially with successful efforts to spread divisiveness and rancor in the American public? Who are the main players and what's being done about it? Peggy Miller said, is there a way to know the difference between real news and fake news? Linda McCarty said, my Republican friends are putting up posts accusing Biden of dementia. It's so frustrating because I remember the horrible Hillary posts. How do we respond to them, or do we ignore them? And Stephanie Bartelt says, what are some methods that counteract propaganda? I wish we could remove the oxygen to the small and very extreme groups, but our media can't help itself. How does our propaganda compare with that of other countries or times in history? Well, this I love because this is obviously what I do. And I always try in these things not to repeat myself. Every week people ask about the Electoral College. That's the very first thing I did in the very first one of these sessions, so I've not repeated it, even though it's fascinating stuff. And I will try not to repeat the stuff that I'm going to say now about propaganda, but by God, we could do this all day long. It's just a fascinating, fascinating subject. Because again, for an idealist, because again, what I believe is that ideas change society. So if you want to change society, you change the way people think. Which seems to me just to be a no-brainer. But that, and of course, the modern era is bearing that out for me. All right, so let's start with this, with the concept of propaganda. So if it is correct that the way you change society is by changing ideas, so how do you change ideas? This whole way of affecting American society by changing the way people think is nothing new at all. So this is one of the reasons that we've had people writing letters to the editor. We have the concept of the soapbox, right? Somebody literally standing on a box in a public square yelling at people to get them to change their minds. One wonders how effective that ever was, but that's, you stand on your soapbox, right? That's just the way things have been done in a free society where we could have ideas compete. And that's absolutely been the case in America. But in the modern era of politics, really since Nixon, something dramatic has happened. And it's not, there were times before that it happened as well. 1864, there's a lot of propaganda quite deliberately done. There's a false pamphlet that purports to be from the Republican side, put out by two Democratic newspapermen that actually gives us the word miscegenation. That's where that word is coined, and it's designed to tar the Republicans as being in favor of black rights, which wasn't going to sell in the 1864 election. So I mean, this isn't new, but what really happens in the modern era is it becomes weaponized in a way that it was not, especially after World War II or even before that. Because under Nixon, you get the committee to reelect the president, known as CREEP. I'm not making this up. CREEP. The committee to reelect the president. And what they do is they start to salt newspapers with editorials in favor of President Nixon. And they're not organic. They're not coming from you and me. They actually have people write these letters and purport to be, Jane Doe from Shady Lane or whatever, saying Nixon's the best thing since sliced bread and I just love him. And they start to salt a lot of stories in the media because they recognize that they can change public opinion. And that, of course, becomes part of the whole sort of propaganda machine, especially on the right. The idea that you can hire, for example, a public relations firm that's going to make your public persona look more attractive to people. And Republican politicians especially use that ongoing after Nixon. So that's one thing. But the reason they do this is because they understand that, especially the Republican Party, especially the movement conservatives, understood how important public opinion is. People naturally tend to gravitate toward what other people are thinking. We're herd animals. We don't want to be the outliers. If somebody is saying a lot of stuff, we kind of tend to believe it, especially if it's one of the first things we hear. And if anybody's interested, if you have been reading me a long time, you will remember there was a day in October right after the report was released about Hillary Clinton's emails. It came out of Chuck Grassley's committee. And I read the report and I wrote about it that day, and I said, it says she didn't do anything wrong. And then the next day, there were so many reports on social media and even in the newspapers that said, oh my God, she did a terrible thing. I was horrified, and I thought, I just told all my readers something that was wrong. And I must have misread it. I know I'm tired. I must have misread it. And I went back and reread the report. And no, I was right. the social media bots and the journalists who were reading what they were retweeting had gotten the story wrong. But there was such pressure on me, a historian who knows how to read these reports, that even though I had personally read that report, I saw all this stuff and I went, I must have gotten it wrong. And that's the way that humans work. You know, we want to get things right. And so I actually wrote about that. The reason I point you back toward that October thing, I don't remember when it was, but I do remember it was October. And I wrote and said, you know, they fooled me. I thought they were right. And that was interesting because I was swamped with bots right then around the blog I write. And I spent an entire day doing nothing but shooting down trolls. And then later that weekend, the U.S. shut down 4 Russian troll farms. And all of a sudden, the trolls let way up. So the point here being that it's really clear that propaganda works, that if you say things enough times, people believe it, even if they don't start believing it, even if they don't want to believe it. If you hear it enough times, you start to believe it yourself. So what's happened now that we have social media is, it's one thing if you had Nixon's people writing letters, you know, a bunch of people sitting in a room writing letters. Now we actually have whole businesses that do that. That go on to Facebook sites, for example, or who go on Twitter, and who deliberately do nothing but go on and try to mess up what real people are saying. So you can see this, for example, if you follow my Facebook stuff. I've been fascinated watching this, and I have to thank the moderators. I no longer do the moderating, I just can't. But I have to thank the moderators. I do watch it. So when I started doing this and it started getting a lot of attention, my trolls were the typical trolls. They were young men. They purported to be. They're not. None of them are real. They purported to be young men saying really kind of offensive, sexist, racist stuff, and we'd erase them. We'd ban them, and they learned. So then next they were elderly, you know, my demographic, you know, women over 50 largely, who said, well, I don't like the way you're talking. But then if you follow them back, they weren't real accounts. So we got those people as well. And now if you look, you can see they're learning. So now they ask questions, and they don't exactly replicate the talking points that you see on other blogs, but they're insinuating those same points. And it fascinates me because you can see their algorithm is learning from the way my real followers talk and from where we draw the boundaries, which says to me that drawing boundaries in public discourse really matters. When we said, no, you can't come on here and call people names, they stopped. When we came on and said, no, you can't come on and recite certain talking points, that stopped too. And you know, they're learning to actually behave, which is first of all interesting. But my point here is that they know it's really important. People who are determined to decide what American society is going to be like, understand that they must control the public narrative, which, by the way, is precisely why I work here on Facebook and on a newsletter rather than writing for the media, the more mainstream media. I used to do all that. I still do it on occasion, but that's why I'm here, is because this is where the propaganda happens, and I'm trying to combat that with actual facts. And that's why I always have my sources. All right, so let's go on about this. One of the ways you can see this is, and one of the ways it's so productive, it's so easy to manipulate American propaganda right now, is because of social technology. So there are literally things called bot farms, where they have banks, and you can see pictures of these where they're really creepy, where they have banks of iPhones, and they will tweet and retweet each other instantly. So they look as if you're following, again, I'm going to pick on, you know, John Smith here, who says he's a trucker from Arizona, but he's actually an iPhone sitting in another country, retweeting the same thing or amplifying sound in the public sphere. And one of the ways this plays out to regular people on the ground is that, for example, how much oxygen the idea of protesters who want to reopen states has gotten. We know statistically that the people who actually feel that way are probably less than 20% of a state, for example, like Kentucky, where Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear has gotten an approval rating of 81%. I mean, that's extraordinary. And yet he was just hung in effigy. By the way, people are hanged. Everything else is hung. So he was hung in effigy. You know, and it got all kinds of attention, and there's all this noise all the time about how we got to open up, we got to open up, we got to open up. Most people don't think we got to open up, but you're hearing it all the time, so you think a lot of people believe we got to open up. That's not to say we don't have economic issues, and there's a conversation to be had there. I'm talking about the propaganda behind this. But one of the things that fascinates me about this is I suspect most of you have not heard that there are protests every single day in front of the White House with people putting down body bags in front of the White House with signs about how this is President Trump's pandemic. Why are you not hearing that? Because the bots are not amplifying that. It's not getting picked up. You got to read those stories, and then an individual has to retweet that. And that's, you know, certainly should be getting as much attention as these other things, but it's not, because it's not getting picked up and amplified. So that's a great example of how this new social media ability to do things really fast, and a lot of them, is changing our propaganda. Okay, so if that's the case, how do you push back on that? People ask about how you push back on it. And one of the things I would say is that it's important not to try and engage one-on-one with this kind of disinformation, because it's a rabbit hole. The whole point is you cannot win this. You know, there's a constant, well, for example, the question about Joe Biden having dementia. How are you going to talk somebody out of that? The idea is just to get you more and more frustrated so that you quit. State once this is not reality, and then move on. Because as long as you are bound within that propaganda case, you're playing their game. You know, what you need to do is be able to say, you go play your game with that, but I'm over here in the real world. And that, again, think about my bots or my trolls who have learned, people learn that if they're going to be part of the conversation, they have to operate in the real world. Are you going to reach everybody? Absolutely not. And this goes back to what I keep saying about treating the real people who are lost like you would your friend in an abusive relationship. You love them, you try and steer them into health again, but there's just nothing you can do to convince somebody. The more you argue against them, the more firmly committed they are to that unhealthy relationship. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about writing your own story and how to write your own story. But I also want to go into why we're in a different place right now than we have before, because I don't think most people understand this material, and it's really interesting. And that is the whole concept of political manipulation in the present era. And the history behind this is simply fascinating. And let me start with here. When you get advertising on television, or when you get advertisements on Facebook, or anywhere else, you think they are selling you a product, that they're selling you a Roomba, or they're selling you the latest cracker. That's not where the money is. That's kind of the byproduct of what happens. What happens is the medium, television or Facebook, is selling you to the advertiser. Let me explain where that came from and how it worked. And I'm going to really try to hit on that, because that really, really, really matters. So think about it this way. The idea of audiences comes out of radio. It doesn't come out of television. And what happens is that when radio first develops, it's really, I mean, first of all, it's the Wild West. Radio development is actually incredibly cool. But no one knows what this medium means. What does it mean to reach this many people with this speed? You know, what does that even look like? What does that mean? And the person who really pioneers this is a guy named Frank Stanton. And this always fascinates me, because fun fact here, I met Frank Stanton at the end of his life. Of course, I had no idea of any of this at all. He was a friend of a friend, and at that point was in a wheelchair, and told us all kinds of fascinating stories about his life at CBS. But I just think it's fascinating that I got to meet this guy and had no concept of the fact he basically changed our entire advertising and media industry. Anyway, in 1934, he was a graduate student. He was a graduate student in psychology at Ohio State. And he needed a dissertation idea. And he wanted to study the radio. And he wanted to figure out how people use the radio. So he did something really interesting. He decided he was going to secretly record how people used their radios. And what he did is he went to them and he said, you know, I'm interested in radios and I want to know how you are listening to the radio. And I'm going to put a little device on your radio that's going to measure how much energy you use when you use your radio, like when it's on, because I want to get a sense of how much electricity we're using. And they're like, okay, that's fine, go ahead and do it. Well, he does, but that's not what the little device does. What the little device did is it actually took a look at what the people were listening to versus what they were going to say they listened to. So he does this, he puts the recording device on it, and for about 3 months, he both records what they're actually listening to, and then he goes back and he has them do a survey and sees what they say they're listening to. And what he discovered was that the households invariably underestimated how much time they were consuming the radio, and way overestimated the quality or the educational benefits of what they were listening to. So, for example, they said that they were listening to educational programs and all kinds of good stuff. They were really listening to entertainment and pop culture. But they didn't want to be known for listening to that. They said they were listening to the highbrow stuff. They were actually listening to the lowbrow stuff. So he's fascinated by this, and he goes to present this material to CBS, the new rising central broadcasting system. And they're fascinated by it. The guys in charge of CBS fascinated by it, and they hire him very early on to go to work for CBS, and he's going to end up being the leader of CBS for like 1,000,000 years. Not quite, but he ends up being the president of CBS for, I think, longer than anybody else. He's president from from 1946 to 1971. Anyway, what he discovered then means that people either misremembered or misrepresented how they were consuming media. So if you really wanted to advertise, what you needed to do was figure out what people really were doing versus what they said they were doing. And once you had done that, then you could go to an advertiser and you could say to them, hey, listen, we've packaged our listeners in these groups, and we can tell you that if you buy access to this group of people, they're about 36% of them are going to buy your washing machine, or 15% of them are going to buy your crackers. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily or I necessarily would buy those crackers, but they can say with certainty that 15% of our group will. So advertising becomes a really clear business. So really what the media is selling is they're not really selling to us, they're selling us to the companies. I hope that's clear, because that's really going to matter in just a second a lot. So if that's the case, what you're really going to do is somebody who's selling advertising, is you want to know more and more and more about your media, your people. You want to find out a lot about them so you can say with great accuracy to the guy selling widgets, 46% of this group of people will buy your widget. So if you give me this much money, you are guaranteed this much in sales. So how are you going to do that? Well, first of all, there's another theorist who says what you got to do is make sure people don't know you're watching them. Because if they know you're watching them, then they're going to pretend they're interested in highbrow stuff or whatever. You want to make sure that you're doing it when they're not looking. So they're really telling you who they are, even if you don't know that they're looking at you. So TV does this, but I'm looking at my time here. I'm going to jump to the chase. This is where Facebook comes in. Facebook knows everything about us, and so do our phones. They're able to tell with extraordinary accuracy how we will behave in certain situations, because they have so many data points on us, and it's really frightening how many data points they have on us. So, for example, people get all upset about things that the government might know about you. What about the fact that our phones, it's actually our phone apps, not our phones that are listening to us, the apps on our phones are listening to us. What about the fact, for example, and all of you this must have happened to, you mention something or someone in passing, and all of a sudden you're getting an advertisement for it. They have all these data points on us. So what that means is this, in terms of politics. First of all, I think this is fascinating, and I hope I have made the point, because this really matters, that what advertisers are doing is not selling us a product. We are the product they are selling to the businesses that are trying to sell stuff to us. That's a really important concept here, because politics. What happened in 2016 is that political consulting firms, especially Cambridge Analytica, which was a British consulting firm that was funded in part by the Mercer family, Robert and Rebecca Mercer, who, father and daughter, who are invest heavily in conservative causes, is they began to use platforms like Facebook to advertise politics, about politics. And people made the mistake of thinking this meant there were ads saying, vote for Donald Trump. No, that's way too obvious. What they did instead was to recognize what I just said. Find data points, find those data groups, and say this group of people is highly susceptible to an advertisement suggesting, or not even an advertisement, a news article suggesting that Hillary Clinton is ill, that she's too ill to manage her to manage a presidency. This group is highly susceptible to a news story suggesting that Hillary Clinton was the one responsible for the super predator idea. They went through and they figured out how to manipulate the people, those groups of people, how to sell them, if you will, an idea, because they had all these data points. And of course, there was a lot of aspects of that that were quite illegal. It turned out some of their data harvesting was illegal. Apparently, I shouldn't say that. I don't believe anyone's gone to jail yet. But that doesn't matter. In a way, you didn't need to make it illegal, because that's simply the way the system, the advertising system, has worked. So that's a really important concept to understand when we're talking about political advertising and political propaganda. All right, so this brings up the next question. First of all, why is there no regulation of this? That's a biggie for sure, but you and I can't solve that except to demand it from our elected representatives. How do you recognize this when it is happening? And that, I think, is the place we can push back. And that is, first of all, to look at who is telling the story and who is making the statement. So, for example, look at the date. That's a big one. You see a lot of things. I always check the date now for the number of times I've been fooled. Is it an old story that no longer has significance, but it looks like it might in the present? But more than that, what are the sources? So here's a really important concept to get. Newspapers, real newspapers, reporters need 3 sources. When they say something, they have to have 3 sources. So I can't just go and say to a reporter, my neighbor did X. They need 2 other people to say that, or they cannot confirm it and they can't print it, or they could print it, but then they're in real trouble. So you want to be with a real newspaper. Now, that's not a real reporter. Now, that's not the same as an opinion page. Opinion pages, the good ones do fact check, but those are supposed to be coming from the writer's head. Really important distinction here, that the Fox News channel, as I say, is primarily entertainment. There are not fact checkers. There are not sources for those stories, with the exception of people like Shep Smith, who's now gone, but also Chris Matthews. So you want, even though they're going to be a conservative slant, they're real reporters. Those sources are going to check out. They're not going to make up stories. They're going to make sure they've got someone saying something. But so that's the real difference between people say, oh, the liberal media. It doesn't matter what your media is, so long as there are sources, proven sources for what they're saying. So look for that, first of all. But there's the next part is, are they playing to your fears? Or is this something that is really of interest? So one of the things that fascinates me, on my phone every day, I get a whole bunch of notifications. And the ones that come from Fox News are always, always, always about somebody being murdered, somebody being eaten by an alligator, some baby being thrown off a building. I mean, it's really not news so much as sensationalism. And that's one thing to look at. Is this something that somebody is trying to make me outraged over? And if so, let's drill down. Are there sources for it? Is it something that is believable. And finally, I think I would add, to tell the difference between real news and fake news, is it crazy? You know, do you think that it's just like the one I always point to is the fear of Sharia law coming to Oklahoma? Oh, come on. You know, let's just not even go there. That's just ridiculous. Now there's a story behind that, and you could untangle that, and that's fairly interesting. But no, of course, Sharia law is not coming to Oklahoma in any meaningful fashion. And the other thing, of course, to look into on this is where's the money going? Who's getting paid for this? Who gets an advantage if I believe what I am being told? And that's another really important thing to see. There is who's getting who's getting paid for this? Is somebody making bank off of what they're telling you? And if so, does it seem fair? You know, is it, are you comfortable paying Sean Hannity the kind of money that we pay him by subscribing to Fox because you think he deserves it? Or are you more concerned about the fact, as I am, that local reporters are losing their jobs right and left? I mean, who really should be getting the money for telling us stories? So if you feel like somebody is making an inordinate amount of money, is it something you're comfortable with? And if so, why? So there's my answer for the history behind propaganda and the history behind real news and fake news. And what I would say, again, to leave on a positive note, as you know I like to do, is how do you challenge this? How do you challenge that kind of propaganda? And what I said earlier and believe is that you don't want to get down into a peeing match with somebody about whether or not there's going to be Sharia law in Oklahoma. I mean, that's a dead end. Once you start to accept the terms of propaganda as they are being thrown at you, even if you're arguing against them, all you're doing is reinforcing that narrative. What we want to be doing, or what I want to be doing, is moving beyond that and saying, this is what I believe, this is the country I want, these are the principles that I care about, this is what America looks like to me, and I'm not going to engage in that propaganda factory that you're working with over there. I'm going to answer it once, and then I'm done. I'm going to go on and move forward and try and move the ball forward. Like I say, try to get the ball over the finish line by building coalitions to take this country where we want to take it. All right, I hope that was useful. I'm sorry I get so excited about this material. Oh, I would like to point out that my understanding of Frank Stanton does not come from me. It comes from a wonderful media historian who's at the University of Maine, a guy named Michael Sokolow, and I highly recommend the stuff he writes. But if you're interested on what I just told you about Frank Stanton and CBS, he wrote a wonderful piece for my history magazine called We're History, in which he talked about this and about the history of it, and kind of digs much more down into the weeds than I just gave you. It's a great piece, and he is also on Twitter if anybody's interested. A great guy to follow on Twitter. All right, again, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a historian. I do not speak for my employer when I do these. And I hope this was useful. If you're interested, I do history, straight history itself, on Thursdays at 1 o'clock. And if you like this, I will be back next Tuesday, 4 o'clock, trying to answer more questions. Thank you very much.